I haven't played with Apple Vision Pro, but I played with Meta's version, which I thought was really fun. I was trying to code with GPT-4 and Claude 3.5 and sort of playing around with it a bit more. I have found a pretty big difference with O1. The persona, I think, is just like a quicker way to achieve it as opposed to, I probably could have created a similar document. My answer was somewhat similar. Like I have 7 or 8 different things I wanted to point out. The first 4 are just like personal things that like broke my frame in some sense, right? Like I sort of had a conversation with a person. I'm like, oh my God, like, nah, AI VTubers is where it's at. I think I can see that happening this year in like a very meaningful way where like AI influences really start to blow up and people start to, what has been your personal tech find? Like favorite personal tech finds? So something that's like enhanced your life in some way, either productivity, creativity, or just like life improvements. AI categorization of my tasks, so it automatically tells me like what the task is or like what company is for. Like commit to using AI for customer support, but using it as a pre-filtering tool to triage it to the right team. Like its accuracy is quite high for that.
Dive into the intriguing world of deep technology and its intersection with business on Technocracy. We're your hosts, Ajay and Loong. Let's explore the breakthroughs and people shaping the future of technology. Technocracy Podcast.
If you guys are listening, we're going to be doing a 2025 kickoff. And so it's going to be sort of a review of 2024 in the context of tech mainly, and then our thoughts for 2025, what we're excited about. There's a couple of questions that I've just generated with AI to help us provoke like more interesting thoughts, essentially. So the first question I had was, what was the best tech release of 2024, and why do you think it stood out?
Trying not to answer this with AI. I put Kazjevi, and actually we talked about Kazjevi in one of our 2024 episodes. So to recap it a little bit, this was the first ever approved gene editing treatment. So it's the first time, it's CRISPR gene editing. So it's the first time that we put CRISPR gene editing technology into humans and seen that it works. So it's the first time we've seen a treatment for sickle cell anemia, which is great. That's previously been an untreated disease, so it's a huge milestone for like people suffering from that particular indication. But it's also a huge step for gene editing in general. And the reason I picked this is that like gene editing is this thing that exists in like the human psyche and sci-fi literature and everything, right? Like gene editing is a big part of sci-fi. And I think in 2024 was the first time it stopped being sci-fi, at least for humans, and started being real. And I think that's freaking cool. Like in terms of like these big steps about stuff that you see in sci-fi literature, AI is one of them. And I think in the last couple of years, we've seen that go from being, just science fiction being real. But gene editing is another one of those things that like is very, very common in sci-fi. Robots would probably be another one, but I picked gene editing.
I was going to say AlphaFold 3 because I thought that was the precursor to this. But like, why did you specifically pick that one?
So AlphaFold 3 I see is like the reason I didn't pick AlphaFold 3, and I did think about it, is because AlphaFold 2 was really the first time like that we said, hey, AI for protein folding is a thing and is like now going to be the go-to tool. AlphaFold 3 just doubled down on that and made it even better and even more practical. But it kind of like how GPT-4 definitely improved upon GPT 3.5. But it was GPT-3 and 3.5 that really said, hey, this is a tool that you can use every day now, and really was the true inflection point. And so for me, and also I don't know how much AlphaFold 3 was even relevant. I don't think it was relevant at all to the development of Kazjevi. You don't actually need those kinds of tools to develop. I mean, they help, but in the particular case of Kazjevi, I don't think they were used.
Okay.
And I always like to focus on the outcomes. So it's like the reason we care about AlphaFold is because in principle it makes it easier to develop treatments. But I kind of prefer focusing on the actual treatment itself.
Makes sense. I had a few. I had 4 like honorable mentions, but I didn't have like a standout winner. So the first one was Apple Vision Pro. I think that came out beginning of this year. Or started getting released beginning of this year. 2024. So yeah, I just thought it was a cool release. It was fun. Made a lot of sense. I've also I haven't played with Apple Vision Pro, but I played with Meta's version, which I thought was really fun. Beyond the gimmick of like trying it 1 or 2 times, like didn't really continue using it after that, but I can kind of see where things are going with that. Also honorable mention to OpenAI's O1 model specifically. So I was trying to code with GPT-4 and Claude 3.5 and sort of playing around with it a bit more, I have found a pretty big difference with O1, like introducing that to my coding flow. So I only started learning to code again 2 months ago or a month ago, like in December, essentially, which I was going to mention in the sort of what skills am I doubling down on. But I have noticed a really big improvement in like how O1 deals with logic. So think of like interesting ways to sort of apply an API. So if I have a specific problem, like, oh, for some reason it's only loading 2 things per page instead of 3 things per page, or the pagination's off, 4 just still like can't figure out exactly what to do with that context, whereas O1 I feel like was better at reasoning through the problem and coming up with a better solution, giving me options for solutions. I also wanted to shout out the video AIs. So I think video AIs have been really interesting the last month or two. Specifically Google Video, I think that's been a much better model for me compared to OpenAI's one. And then another shout out to Google, which is Notebook LM, which I think is like a pretty underrated tool. I've only been playing with it like a little bit, but the fact that you can, even Gemini, the fact that you can query your entire Google Drive is pretty powerful. And I think once the models get a bit better, that context window is going to be really important for being able to sort of go through and try a drive. So one of the things I did recently was I queried the entry level sort of drive and said, hey, based on every document you have on us, like what are the most common copywriting phrases we use? What is like a writing style that makes sense? What does our customer persona look like? Like asking these really broad questions on a really big data set. And that was really interesting. I could feed that into Claude to like improve my copywriting and things like that. So,
and do you find it like gave you answers that you felt were meaningful and insightful, like things you didn't already kind of know?
The persona, I think, is just like a quicker way to achieve it, as opposed to, I probably could have created a similar document. I thought what was good was pulling out specific phrases of copywriting that have been used across the time, right? Because it's very hard for me to search. So if anything, it was just like a much more powerful search query where I could like go even a level above in terms of abstraction. So instead of searching for specific phrases, I could say like, what phrases do you think were really powerful for copywriting? Which that kind of search was just not possible before. Yeah,
that makes sense. I feel like I have not used Notebook LM at all. Like I think I had privacy concerns, and then because we're a tech like company in-house, we have a lot of our own versions of this that we've been developing to integrate into our product. And so we use that. So like, you've got kind of your own RAG database with AI layered on top. And so you end up using that more than you end up using like specific third-party solutions because you can't integrate those. I feel like O1, I actually like the O1 model. I really don't like using.
Okay.
I find it obscenely verbose, and like when it tries to plan something out, I just like it has like 6 steps that it wants to do, and then it just like immediately starts executing all of them, and it takes ages to get through them all, and it doesn't actually go in depth into any of these steps. I found Claude way better, both for programming as like trying to program really sophisticated stuff. The ChatGPT models are all still really challenging. If you're trying to code simple stuff like how do I fix pagination, I think they're fine. I was trying to build a Hindley normal type system into my programming language, and Claude was incredible. Like I pulled this off in maybe 1 to 2 full-time working days total, which is just obscenely fast for something like this. And I mean, shout out to Claude for being able to like, achieve that. Whereas I didn't even attempt with GPT because I just knew it wasn't going to.
What's the longest thinking time you've had with O1? Have you played enough with it to like get it to think for long?
I've had it in the minutes.
Okay.
But it's not the thinking. It's even just the executing. It's just like, oh, here's the 6 things we want to do, and then it just like rambles for each of those 6 things. You're like, hang on a second. Like realistically, I want to actually take this step by step. And Claude kind of does that. It like lays out 6 points, and it's like, do you want me to continue? Like, which one do we want to dive into first? And it's a little bit more interactive, and the human in the loop process feels a bit better. So it's clear that behind the scenes, it's doing some planning stuff, but it seems to be happier to involve you and get corrections from you. And that experience is just easier to work with for me, at least.
That makes sense. I think I've only used it for very specific things, and it's usually some sort of reasoning, math, or like coding specifically. Like another example, just to be a bit more specific, I use it for like is planning the game mechanics for like a board game I was trying to play around with. So I've been tinkering with this board game for months just because whenever I get spare time, but it was pretty useful in like sort of I don't know how accurate it is, but like mock play testing my board game, sort of thinking through like what could happen or like edge cases and like what players might do. And yes, the best way is to just watch players do it, but it did come up with some interesting sort of edge cases, which I incorporated into the rule set as well.
That's interesting. I think maybe the difference there is that where I found a really big difference with Claude is when I'm diving into deeply technical things. And it lays out, it's like, these are the things that we want to do. Shall we get started? And I have to say, okay, before we do that, like, I actually feel like I don't understand the theory on point 3 deep enough for us to begin that. So can we just discuss the theory first for a bit? Whereas O1 kind of just YOLO goes for it, and I can't even tell if it's right because I don't understand what it's trying to do.
Makes sense.
All right, let's move to question 2. Which emerging technology or business model are you most excited to see develop in 2025?
I have a pretty... I don't know if these answers are boring because maybe we're just like in the space so much that we just hear these things over and over again. And maybe to someone outside of the space, they're like, oh yeah, I didn't actually realize about Notebook LM and things like that. But the thing I'm most interested in is probably personalized healthcare at the moment. So this whole Peter tier, like healthcare 3.0 sort of model, which is like preventative healthcare and sort of like getting more data and sort of thinking through things earlier rather than after the thing has happened. How do you fix it? And the reason I say that is because I was thinking about sort of hyper growth spaces or things that I think are going to be really exciting over the next 5 years and like what's going to develop really quickly. AI is one of those things, but the other thing I think it lacks is the lack of certainty in the roadmap. Like it's just very difficult to figure out where things are going to go 6 months from now, 12 months from now. And so if I started an AI company and sort of worked in the AI space, it just, I don't know if that thing's going to be around in 6 months. Whereas I feel like the roadmap for personalized healthcare is slightly more certain. Like
I feel like there's this, I guess, trope, or I don't know what you want to call it, when people look up to certain business leaders. And the one that people point out from Jeff Bezos is like, find the thing that's always going to be true. And I actually found a quote the other day. I can't remember where it was from, but I feel like it was really, like, it stuck with me. And it kind of embodies that too, which is that invariants withstand transformation and therefore represent the essence of the object or phenomenon, right? So you're looking for something that like stays true no matter how the world changes. And I think the interesting thing about personalized health is people always going to want to be healthy, right? More or less, right? And so that's a space that's like, no matter what AI does to us in the next 10 years, we still want to live and be healthy. Maybe AI will change how we do that. Maybe AI will change how we spend our day, but we'll still want more days, better days, healthier days. And I think that's always going to be true no matter what the roadmaps have in store for us. Whereas like, what does it mean to be an engineer? It's like, well, apparently that's going to change radically. So I kind of agree with you on that one. That's a good one to pay attention to.
What did you have on yours?
Well, for business models, I actually had a return to pay once, or like pay per use, because I feel like pay per use got slowly perverted into a subscription model because usage was too fine-grained to measure on a per usage basis. And we're actually kind of seeing a return to that with partially with AI. So like a lot of these APIs are like token driven. So you're spending money on tokens and you're spending money on compute. So like cloud kind of introduced this idea originally of like pay as you go, like you use a certain number of compute hours, we charge you for those compute hours. And then eventually cloud services just started slapping subscription fees on it. It's like everyone got subscription fatigue. I have insane subscription fatigue. And I've been seeing a resurgence of paid ones. And it's not that I'm excited by it. I'm interested to see whether it can hold up and whether it will actually work. And I like the idea of owning your shit. And I think one of the reasons that this sparked it for me is like I recently moved my residency into Australia. So now I'm a dual resident of Singapore and Australia. And my Apple account region settings just completely fucked what books I have access to, what movies I have access to. So even though I bought this movie in Singapore and it is available in Australia, for whatever reason, the digital rights rules mean that I need to buy it again. I was like, this is just kind of bullshit. Like, what happened to owning something? So yeah, pay once models, like, I'd be interested to see where that goes. And I hope people can make it work and make it as convenient and as profitable as like subscription models. So that's the business side of things, like the business model aspect of that question. For emerging tech,
I think just to add to that, right? I think the world has like overcorrected with subscriptions, right? Like everyone slapped on a subscription to everything. It's not just the SaaS things, but like, the fact that like for Aura, you got to pay a subscription for like all these like different tools. Yeah. Like, or even the,
But there's this counter correction because like there's this, I think it's called, there's another version of this ring that is apparently not as good yet, but doesn't require a subscription. I think it's called like Ultra Human or something like that.
yeah. I have seen the ones with that subscription as well. But then also the bike, the Peloton, where you have to pay a subscription for that as well. Like, I just think it's ridiculous that like everything's just become this subscription-based economy. And I think people are now getting to the point where, so we had this overcorrection where everyone added subscriptions to everything because that's what the VCs wanted. They wanted recurring revenue. They wanted stable revenues. And like, I can understand that from an investor perspective, but I think consumers have hit like a breaking point where they're just like, I'm done. Like,
one of the other breaking points for me was I sat down to watch a film on Amazon Prime the other day. Right, this was one that it was a series that I had purchased on Apple, and then when I moved to Australia, it was like, oh, you can't watch this anymore. I was like, okay, fine, whatever. So I went to Amazon Prime. I have a Amazon Prime subscription, yet you still see ads, and you still need to purchase some things. And I'm like, what the fuck am I paying a subscription for? I'm paying a monthly fee for the right to buy movies. Like, that's kind of bullshit.
Yeah, that gets to me. And also the fact that they're now slapped on ads, even though you're paying monthly as well.
Kills me. Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense. Even like, I think the Netflix model is slightly better because they say like, okay, you can pay less and opt in for ads, or you can pay more and just not have ads, which like I respect that a little bit more. Whereas like Prime is just like slapped on ads regardless of what you pay for. So it used to be a really good membership because you pay for Prime, you get the delivery for free and you get like free content as on top of that. But now it's just become, what do they say? Like they start with really good service, like over deliver, undersell. Like Uber was really cheap when it first came out, and then they slowly just become worse and worse over time. But you've just become so attached to it.
You transform the market, and then you start exploiting essentially, right?
Yeah. So we're in exploitation phase, which is not super great. Did you have another one for?
So in terms of emerging technology, like I think we've to go back to 01, we've started to see these planning models, and we've started to see inference time scaling, and it's opening the door to things like what Future House is working on. So these like autonomous scientific researchers, and I'm really interested to see where that goes because holistically, I think AI makes robotics much easier. Because there's a very general type of intelligence that you need for robotics. There's also super specific types of intelligence, but you also need general intelligence. And I think a lot of science, and people might not know this, is just emailing people. Emailing people to order reagents, emailing 6 people to figure out who has the cheapest reagents, working with customs officials to get your fucking compounds out of the port, reading up on which assays and experiments are available with which vendors, and all this kind of shit. And then there's the reading of publications and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of operational stuff that, at the very least, it's clear that the operational side of things will get replaced by AI. And then it's becoming a little bit clearer that actually some of these scientific AIs are going to begin surpassing, and some have already begun to surpass, human performance in terms of planning out scientific experimentation. And so I'm just really keen to see where that goes in 2025. And do we actually just, can everyone be a scientist?
Do you think that replaces the human, or do you think there's always going to be a human element of deciding what experiments to do and pointing in the right direction? Okay.
I have no idea. Like when you think about taking some of these autonomous AIs to the limit, so to speak, you do kind of feel like the human gets totally removed. But I don't know how close to that limit these AIs will ultimately be.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think like what I'm about to say sort of links into my point, which was the fourth question, which we can jump straight to that. But basically it was, what was the most surprising innovation or pivot in tech industry? And I think to me, it was like the rise of logic and thinking when it comes from like what I used to think AI was just like, it was this, like just guessing the next word based on like what probability says, like, oh yes, like this is what we think the next word was. But there's now all these emergent properties, and I still don't really find, I still don't fully understand how we're getting these emergent properties to sort of come out of these base level LLMs. And also I just find it insane. Like I just find the whole concept crazy that we've like been able to do this within like 12 months or so. So that to me was the most surprising innovation. Do you have any thoughts on?
I felt like it wasn't surprising. It was cool, but I don't feel like it was surprising. Like when these GPT models first dropped in 23, people were building agents straight away. And a lot of them sucked, but it was pretty clear that was the direction it was going to go. And so I don't feel like it was a pivot. I feel like it was a very natural evolution of where these things were going.
But there was a change, right?
There was a change in how we approached it.
Because initially I just thought it was like, you could just generate large bodies of text. That's the only use case I was thinking of it as. But then like it slowly shifted when 4 came out, so, even 3.5 to some extent. That
so
logic
those
started bringing. Yeah.
Those models still just produce text.
Okay.
Right. I think it's the O1 model is the first one that has any sort of inference time like change, and even that is actually just text generation. So it's like taking tokens that haven't quite been fully parsed and just like cycling them back in and like doing that over and over again. Simplifying, but the core architectures are different as far as I can tell. I mean, O3 hasn't been discussed openly, so they may have a fundamentally new architecture, but I don't think it's fair to bring that into the equation yet because no one can really use it or access it. It's just been surprising. Maybe what's been surprising is how far you can push just text generation to appear to be like a planner and a tool user. So the way that these tools actually work, right, is you kind of have a name for something. You're like, here's the name of a tool, and here's a description about what the tool does. And here's a whole list of that name and description. And I'm going to send that to the AI along with, as like a preamble, along with a question. And one of the things that the AI will just do as a text generator will just generate text saying, if it was up to me, I'd probably use this tool. And it sends that back to the front end, or like sends that back to whoever sent it the question. And then whoever gets that back just executes the tool verbatim, right? And so it appears like the AI is doing stuff, but the AI is just generating text saying, well, if this was the tools, and then I got asked a question, and I got asked which tool I should use, the natural next set of tokens is the name of the tool that I think is appropriate. And then an execution platform comes in underneath and executes it. That was pretty obvious to most people working in the field at the very beginning, but I think it took a long while for the AIs to get good enough that it worked well. And we did change the exact strategy for how we pull it off. So it was cool. Wasn't super surprising.
Then is it even feasible for it to come up with new things in general? Like just something that has like a completely original thought that's never come out. I have two lines of thinking here. One is that like original thoughts are generally just like mashing two different thoughts together and you generally make a new one. So like taking a principle from biology and applying it to computer science and you suddenly have a thought. But then I don't know if all thoughts actually fall under that. So like, I am curious if AI is and this is the broader question of like, where does humanity fit with the AI? Like, is there still a world where we're still needed to give original thought to like train the models?
Look, I don't think we have proven how far some of these things can and can't go. Certainly there are ways in which you can prompt LLMs to do less obvious things. So the way that the next token generator actually works is it literally has a vector of all possible tokens and it gives you a probability distribution. And what you can do is you can intentionally sample out of distribution, right? And that starts giving you, quote unquote, less probable tokens. Now, if you push that too far, you'll just get nonsense because it's just like, you'll just start saying this doesn't even grammatically make sense. But you can tune that and try and like edge it into a place where it's picking things that are maybe less probable, but are still probable enough that they're sensible. So there are things like that you can do. How much does that push to original thoughts? Hard to say. Depends on what you define as original. Obviously, original thoughts are possible because we got our thoughts as humans from something. Like someone had the first thought.
It's fair. We can move into who influenced you most in 2024, and then we'll come back to, I'm curious to hear your surprising innovation, but who influenced you the most?
I have a brown nose answer and I have a different answer. My first answer to this question was actually you. I think working with you on this podcast and having you come into my company for a little while really influenced my thinking in a dramatic way. which is kind of why I wanted you to work with us, because you have a very different way of thinking about product and markets than I do. And you made me doubt myself, which I think is really, really powerful. Ty, one of my co-founders, also has this ability. So he's constantly influencing me, and I guess that's why he and I make such good co-founders. And I think that has influenced the direction that I'm taking parts of my company, the discussions that we've had based on what you saw when you joined. So that's my brown nose answer. My less brown nose answer is there's this group called Inductive Bio. They're an AI drug discovery company. And they have this blog, which is just really thoughtful. They don't post much on it. I think they have 4 in total, and they discuss AlphaFold 3 compared to other docking techniques. And they showed that if you just apply docking judiciously and carefully, you actually outperform AlphaFold 3 still. So, and how much does it really help? And then, they talk about how LLMs work with chemistry. Can they speak chemistry? Can they understand chemistry? And they do breakdown of that. They also did a thing on ADME, so absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. So predicting those properties of drugs is really important, because you want to make sure it metabolizes correctly, that you excrete it eventually. And so just looking at the state of the art of benchmarks and going into a really, really nuanced discussion, which doesn't usually get nuanced, which is how to deal with benchmarks properly. Everyone kind of says it off the cuff, where they're benchmarks are kind of not very good, but whatever. And then no one actually goes into the details, but they actually expand it out and they bother doing the work and showing, hey, this is the right way. Here's where the Simpson paradox is actually emerging, and all these kinds of things. And then they do an in-depth analysis of the existing models that are out there. I found that really influential to my thinking, and just trying to absorb those ideas and make sure that in my own company we weren't falling for the same things.
That's awesome. Well, first of all, I appreciate it. Thank you. My answer was somewhat similar. I have 7 or 8 different things I wanted to point out. The first 4 are just personal things that broke my frame in some sense, right? I sort of had a conversation with a person. I'm like, oh my God, that's crazy. It's just the glass breaks in my brain. And I try to be a little bit more specific. So I think when it comes to your information diet is completely different to mine. Well, not completely. There's probably a Venn diagram there somewhere, but you tend to absorb things that are very different. And there's so many times where there's a paper, for example, how does Claude work? I read it, I'm I have no idea how this is going to work, but I have you to basically be my filter for that kind of world, essentially. So I appreciate you for that. Another one was Brett, who does email marketing for courses. He does for Tozy, which is photography courses, essentially. And it sounds a little specific, but when he showed me his email funnels, I was sort of had this glass breaking moment where he had basically scheduled an email every day for 5 years straight. And he has that flow running for every customer. So if you sign up as a customer, for 5 years, he's already planned out your email journey, right? So what is that, 1,500 emails? That would be
so fucking annoying. If I get more than 2 emails from someone a week, blocked.
But the thing is, right, yeah, you may block it or you may unsubscribe. But if people keep opening the emails for 5 years straight, he's going to send it. And so it's just so interesting that he had these funnels and the intensity of email that he did. So for example, if you open the first email on day 1 and click this button, it will send you the next email immediately, right? So you could just fast track your way through the funnel. And he just made me reevaluate how intensely I've been doing email conversion funnels. So very specific story, but it hit me really strongly. Another one was this guy called Andrea from Italy, who had been making money by doing search arbitrage, which is not even a business model I ever considered. But basically, the TLDR is, if Google has customers who are willing to pay for a search term, for example, CRISPR, right? If you wanted to advertise on the search word CRISPR, but not many people are actually searching for CRISPR, what does Google do? They're not going to be oh, you want to give me $100,000 a month for the search term CRISPR? Well, we'll go find people that are going to search for CRISPR. So what they do is they pay guys like Andrea to advertise on TikTok and Facebook to drive traffic to the search page result of CRISPR, and then they sort of will feed it to the business, right? And the point here is that if Google can acquire a search page visitor for 30 cents and then sell it to you for 50 cents, they still make money, right? And so it just blew my mind. I was like, I never even thought of that as a business model, but it made so much sense in hindsight.
So driving, just to clarify this, upping the amount that users are searching for a particular term so that you can find all those users and sell them to a business as potential.
I'll give an easy example. For example, if you search leather shoes in Italy, and you want to target people who are searching leather shoes in Italy because you're an e-commerce store that sells that, but there's not enough search volume for that term, what Andrea will do is run a TikTok ad for leather boots and then send you to the search page where then you'll see the ad, right? So it's like an extra step, but they get paid for every click that someone clicks on the ad because Google gets paid for the click. And that money gets funneled back into Andrea's bank account, basically, for doing that. And then he pays TikTok for running the ad. So it's like this weird, like...
Wow, I can't wait to see what the AI version of that's going to be.
Yeah. So I wrote an article about this, if you're interested, on AJ's Quest, like telling Andrea's story. I just thought it was a cool one. And the fourth one's more of a personal thing where, like, Cyrus, a friend of mine who I met in Bali, did this, like, meditation thing. And he was like, we're going to meditate for an hour. Or like an hour and a half. And I thought, like, there's no chance I can sit there for an hour and a half. And I just had my preconceived notions sort of challenged because I thought that it'd take a really long time and I'd sort of be sitting there wondering about what to do for the next 1.5 hours. But it felt like 5 to 10 minutes. It did not feel like 90 minutes, the way he sort of ran the meditation. So it just like made me rethink meditation. Maybe I should do it for longer. Maybe I'll reintroduce it. To be fair, I've not meditated since. I did it in November, but he showed me what's possible, essentially, which I appreciated.
I feel like I learned a version of that on long-haul flights, where I would like...
Are you raw dogging your flights?
I wouldn't say I was raw dogging it, and I don't want to say that I was doing it before it was cool either, but like in 2021, towards the end, I was taking a couple of long-haul flights, and I figured out that it was actually not so bad to just sit there and listen to music and do nothing, and just like kind of soak in the vibes, which admittedly is easier to do when you're sitting in a business class seat and you have the whole bed to yourself, and like, it's not as noisy and it's not as cramped.
Totally fair.
But I found that to be a really decent way to pass the time. I was able to do that for maybe 4 or 5 hours. At one point, the staff were getting kind of concerned, and they were like, "Are you sure you don't want to eat? Are you sure?" Like,
that's. I can totally imagine that happening, because I'm guessing most people in business class are working or like doing random stuff, right? Like actually doing stuff. Yeah. Okay. I probably have like half a dozen more, but I think what I'm going to do is, if you are listening and you're not subscribed to my newsletter, I'm going to publish it on my newsletter. So, I want to convert more people into my newsletter through this podcast. So if you're listening, just ajs.quest, subscribe, and I'll send you like the last 6 months, like how my information diet has changed. Because I actually found that question to be the most interesting for me personally. I just like had so many answers for that. Yeah. On to the most surprising innovation or pivot point. What do you have?
So this is actually where I was going to bring up Apple Vision Pro. Because I remember at the time, Apple very rarely, like historically, goes into a new device market as one of the first movers. It usually waits for it to mature quite a bit and then nails the experience. And that's usually more of its play. So releasing this sort of like beta developers only device was kind of like, I did not expect them to go into virtual/augmented reality anytime soon. So I was really surprised that they like launched with this device, especially since it just didn't solve an obvious consumer problem. It didn't have an obvious application, and the technology was like super inaccessible. Like it's like, what is it, $5,000 in Australia? It just didn't seem to fit into their traditional play. So it was surprising to me. Like, I would have thought that they would wait for more market growth in that like field in general, and then come in with just like the best version of it. And from what I've heard, it's not even the best version. Like, it's certainly sleek, and they've got that Apple brand to it a little bit. Yeah, I didn't expect them to do that. And in the question also has, how did it change your approach to business or tech? It didn't really, but for a while, it made me step back and say, okay, is augmented reality going to be a thing? Should we think about, we have one of our pieces of technology at QDX is that we built these 3D renderings of molecules. We sort of stepped back and said, should we be doing this in AR? Like, would this be meaningful to do in AR? Would it be helpful to have this in sort of like a fully immersive experience? We ultimately decided no. But it did make me pause for a second.
I actually think it's underrated. I think AR and VR is pretty underrated at the moment because everyone's looking at AI at the moment and no one's looking. There's some spaces which I think are equally sort of bullish but don't have the same amount of hype around them. Maybe underrated is not the right word.
I feel like
yeah.
AR and VR, especially AR, needed AI to be meaningful. You needed AI to be good enough that you could say, just put something on my desktop, right? Like my literal physical desk, make it seem like it's there. Or like, detecting objects in 3D space and replacing them in 3D space, like detecting what the reality is and then feeding a replacement image over it that's believable, needed AI, right? So you needed like the modern advances in like image generation and video generation and object detection that has all sort of come around the same time as these LLMs for AI and for AR to even be approximately a good user experience. So I think we'll see those grow hand in hand. Same with robotics.
Yeah. I have something that is a little random, but this is something I just thought was like, this shocked me a lot. So have you seen this? Neurosummer?
No.
Okay, so don't ask me how I stumbled across this on my YouTube. But basically, like one of the gaming YouTubers I follow, like Doug, did a collaboration with Neurosummer. And Neurosummer is basically an AI VTuber, right? Like it's a pretty straightforward concept. But I think when I watched the video, I was really surprised into like, how witty Neurosummer was. Like it didn't actually feel like I was listening to an AI because she was just like so, like the jokes she was making was so context specific. Like she knew what was going on. And she was in this video, she was basically playing GeoGuessr against Doug. And Vidal, who is the developer of Neurosummer, is the little turtle on top of her head. So he talks as well. And generally the videos are him sort of doing something and Neurosummer sort of commenting and sort of like making jokes and stuff like that. So they like kind of do it together. When I looked into like the tech, he hasn't open sourced anything, and nor does he plan to because like he doesn't want to give away his secret sauce in some sense. But I swear his technical development was ahead of OpenAI and some of these bigger AI companies. Like he had real-time voice before OpenAI came out with it. Some of the models he's created, like the amount of lines of code that go into Neurosummer is like, I think he sent something like 5,000, 10,000 lines of code to like actually create this like really authentic sort of experience. And he like talks about the upgrades he gives her, like so she can see the screen or like she can understand this context or she can see Twitch chat and sort of respond to it. It just blew my mind how far ahead he was compared to some of the more traditional sort of pathways for like AI. Considering this is what he's chosen to do.
I mean, it's the same thing with all technology, right? Nothing beats having a really super clear vertical, right? Like you can cut corners. It's not even cutting corners because like you just don't need some shit, right? Whereas when you're OpenAI, you don't know what your tools are getting used for. They have to be sort of like workable for entire enterprise groups. So they really have to have quite a broad spectrum of things that work and work really well. Whereas in something like Neurosummer, you can be very pointed and only work on stuff that like, and also like not only just work on the stuff that is meaningful to what you're trying to do, but like also just stuff that you find interesting and passionate about. And that's always going to like the agency, the passion gives you is not to be underrated.
Yeah. This is one of those frame breaking moments where like I was laughing at things she was saying and I was thinking like, what the hell? Like, I can't believe this AI is like entertaining me because I just haven't had that experience before. Like I haven't found any of the AI stuff that like you ask her for a joke has been pretty like mellow.
That's interesting. So like there was a time when people were using AIs to write like screenplays. And there was this one, and I think it must have been in like 2021, maybe even earlier, which was like a tiny little script between a founder and a VC. And if I haven't shared it with you, I'll share it with you after this. And I thought that was the funniest fucking thing. Like I was laughing so hard at that. And when I found out it was AI generated, I was like, that was my shattering moment. Like, okay, AI's actually figured out how to be funny. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I actually haven't had that experience until that video, which was
Right.
frame breaking.
I've got this thing saved because it is actually that funny, so I'll find it and I'll send it to you.
Okay. Going into areas that would be good to invest in, so one specific area, I have put AI VTubers as like a specific place, or like AI influencers, just because I totally see it. I think that makes so much sense.
Wait, let me structure the question for you. Let me frame it so people listening know what's going on. Because I think you're about to move to the next question, which is, if you could invest in one specific area of tech right now, what would it be, and what is the potential you see there? All right, so AI influencers. Go.
Yeah, I decided to just focus on that. Like, I was thinking like personalized healthcare and I had all this other stuff, but I was like, nah, AI VTubers is where it's at. I think I can see that happening this year in like a very meaningful way, where like AI influencers really start to blow up and people start to, if you think about the content sort of space in someone's brain, they typically have like 3 or 4 people that they like constantly watch, and I can totally see position number 1, 2, 3 being taken up by an AI influencer in some way. Just because I think they're getting funny enough, they can like now watch the content and actually play games and things like that, and like it makes sense to me that it's going to happen. And I think the VTuber style content has enabled the AI VTuber space, because now like there's an easy bridge, right? Before it was just like a person sort of manning the VTuber sort of, what do you call it? Like, I think they call it something. They call it like the avatar. Yeah, the VTuber avatar was like controlled by a human, right? So it'd be someone streaming and then it gets converted to the VTuber, but you never see the human. So it's pretty easy for you to just hot swap out the AI in, and like no one really can tell. So that's why I think that like the VTuber space specifically has enabled AI in this space.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. I don't watch any video content, really. Like, okay. I don't subscribe to any YouTube channels other than like Kurzgesagt and 3 Blue 1 Brown. So I wouldn't invest in that space simply because it's nothing I know.
Fair. Like, I think normal human beings who live on planet Earth,
how dare you, AJ?
Majority of the population who are less intelligent than you probably spend more time on YouTube, like myself. I don't specifically watch VTuber content, but I can totally see it. Totally see it.
Fair enough. I picked really boring ones. I mean, like, I feel like these are just like, they kind of both feel like no-brainers. And maybe one is more of a pipe dream. Chip manufacturing, it feels obvious. Like, that space is going to go massively. It's just, I don't think we have figured out how to make these machines that are running our AIs as efficient as possible. I think the kinds of margins that NVIDIA is like absolutely raking in right now are not sustainable from a free capital markets perspective. Other people are going to come in and start undercutting those costs. So I think there's a huge opportunity if you were a good investor to find the right teams and invest in the right teams. And if I had that kind of access, that would be dope. The other one is like next gen nuclear. And I kind of like, I annotated this with this like comment that I wish I even knew what the investable structure of that space was, because it's like super deep tech and it's also super political. Like, you can't just build a cool piece of technology and then be off to the races. Like, there is this huge political game that also has to be played that you're at the whims of. And so I don't even know, like, structurally, how does next gen nuclear come about? The reason I listed it is because I think it's super important. Like, even on the back of AI, we're going to need crazy amounts of energy. And slapping a nuclear reactor right next to a giant data center makes a ton of sense to me. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting one. It did get me, like, I was thinking about this because I was listening to this podcast with this billionaire on it who's talking about how he makes a lot of money, which is through oil and gas. So he buys land, he then rents the land to ExxonMobil, like whatever company wants to take the oil out. And the capital structure is that he gets 25% of whatever they pull out, like in terms of revenue, which I thought was like crazy. He just rents land to this massive company. Maybe it's a couple of $1 million upfront investment, or maybe tens of millions. I don't know how much it actually costs for that, but it's a pretty good yield if you think about it. Like, you're going to make a lot of money.
Yeah. I mean, if you buy the right places, right? And I think that's what I mean by next gen nuclear and not knowing how to invest in that space. Like, I don't even know what is the revenue structure? Like, what are the ways that you actually make money from that?
There has to be something similar where you just like buy a plant or something like that and just sell the energy to someone, or
no clue. It's a very opaque space as well.
Yeah. Any other spaces you find interesting?
I tried to stray too far away from AI, and like, I mean, there are a couple of AI things that I would be really interested in. I mean, they tie in with the other stuff that we've talked about, right? So like autonomous scientific agents, AI that's working in the health space. Because I mean, I think you and I were both just talking about what stays the same, and health is one of those things. And I think there's personal health, which is like looking after yourself, but I think there's also medicine, right? And our ability to develop new medicines and treat diseases, do genetic editing. I do invest in that space. I mean, I guess to some descriptors, it's why I'm in this space, because that's the space I believe in some sense, the most. So I'm investing my most important resource, which is my time.
Mm. Do you have a wow moment for 2024? Because I think for me, it was just O1 and being able to code was like
I do, wow actually, moment. And it's very different. It is kind of AI centric. Do you know this guy called Victor Talon? No. Well, I think he just goes by Talon on Twitter, Taelin. If you're a computing nerd and you aren't familiar with his content, go read it. It's super genuine, it's super in-depth, and it's fucking awesome. So in 2024, he released this thing called Bend, which is, at the highest level, it's a new programming language. What was really interesting about it was that it's based on a fundamentally new type of computational calculus that I had never encountered, called interaction combinators. And it's super simple and super elegant. And basically what it is you can kind of think about it as you describe these really abstract circuits. Like there's a wire, and one side of the wire is called A, the other side is called B, and then there's another wire and it's called, gamma, and the other one's called, I don't know, phi, right? Or A, B, and X, Y, let's say. And they cross over at the center. You say, that's my circuit. And then you have a different diagram that's like, okay, if I ever see A and X like this, then I can sort of wire them up and remove a bit of complexity. And so you can model your entire program as just these wires, and then you look for all these little patterns in how the wires connect, and you have a system of rules that says when you see this pattern, you can replace it with this simpler pattern. And you just apply these patterns over and over and over and over and over again. And the nice thing about that is it's obscenely parallel. In fact, it's theoretically optimally parallel, because you can just, however many threads you happen to have, each of them just looks for a pattern and replaces it. And then you just do this in sequences, like, you do one round of replacement, then another round of replacement. And so he built this programming language, the first high-level programming language ever built on top of this form of calculus. And it completely, it forced me to rethink the fundamentals of like what computing even is as a mathematical framing.
Can you give me more of like a practical example? Like why? Give me an example that shows the significance of that.
So the best way to, the reason why it's really cool is once you've built a high-level programming language on top of this that compiles into these circuits, you can just write your programming language as it makes intuitive sense to you as a programmer. And you don't even have to think about the parallelism, because you know that it's going to be compiled to a process, like to a representation
is this
that is always maximally parallel.
Is it replacing logic gates? Is that what you're saying? Like what level of the stack?
At the theoretical level.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So instead of thinking about functions calling other functions, or like addition adding two things together, you're just thinking about them as like this pattern of circuit gets replaced with this pattern of circuit.
Okay.
And you can go on his Twitter, and he has pictures of all these patterns, and there's only I think there's only 6 of them. So they're really, really simple. And so the implementation is also very easy to understand if you're technical. And I just never seen anything like this before. It was really cool. I've always been interested in massively parallel computing, and this was an approach to it that I had just never considered, which is essentially just pattern replacement. And if you can create a rules pattern replacement that are able to be executed in parallel trivially, and then you build a programming language that compiles to that set of rules, then by definition, your programming language is itself maximally parallel. And that's really, really, really freaking cool. And he's got all these examples of here's a program, and you look at that program as a program, and you're like, yep, that's how I would write that. And he's like, if you execute this in C, it's got this speed. And if you execute it in Bend, it's got 100x speed up, because it's able to use every single core simultaneously. And you haven't had to change the code at all, right? He's like, here it is compiled to C, and then you run it, and then here it is compiled to, what he calls HVM, which is that underlying representation. And it's just 100x faster because it can just trivially parallelize itself. And that's really freaking cool. I'd never considered that. So it was like, that was like a wow moment discovering this kind of technology. And the really cool thing is that he developed a potential approach to solving Arc AGI using this technique. So like leaning really hard into the fact that really LLMs are just fancy pattern matches, essentially. And because you have this massively parallel, it's so massively parallel that it can actually do complexity compression. So you can prove that there are certain algorithms that are like exponential in complexity under traditional lambda calculus that in interaction combinator calculus are linear or even constant time. And so that allows you to start exploring algorithms that maybe you wouldn't have been able to explore traditionally, and using that as an approach to try and solve Arc AGI. He hasn't solved it, obviously, but he's made some interesting progress. And he's also really genuine about the progress he's making. So he's like, hey, this is cool, it's potential, I have no idea where it's going to go. You could hit a wall in 5 minutes and then I'll be done. But he's basically constantly live tweeting what he's working on. So it's really, really interesting.
Is he just some guy, or does he run a company? Or?
He's just some dude. He founded a company called Higher Order Computing, and then he was thinking about raising VC money, and he's like, I don't want to really be distracted by VCs. I think he made some money in crypto, so he's not super in need of money. I try not to get too into his personality and just like focus on his content.
Yeah, focus on the ideas. Okay, that's cool. I like that. So global trends. So the question is, looking at global trends, which key market or region seems poised to make the biggest impact in tech or business in 2025? I changed the question up a bit. I think I try to focus on how tech may impact some key markets or regions in like an interesting way, right? And I had one thought, like, I mean, there's a few thoughts that like you could talk about AI, healthcare, whatever. But what I found really interesting was like, you know, the Philippines is built on BPO, right? And like, what happens if that just disappears? Like, I find that really interesting as a thought experiment to think about like what happens in the next few months is like business process automation no longer needs to be outsourced to these companies that like generally pay a few dollars an hour to get these processes done, but then AI can take over those things. And then beyond that, like continuing sort of the thought experiment in some of these emerging markets, I'm really curious to see how Africa, Southeast Asia, which are very young populations, like how they're impacted by AI and some of these trends over the next few years. I think that aging populations will probably have a net benefit just because we have less people working, and having AIs taking over some function of the economy would probably be a net benefit for especially populations with like median ages of 50, 45, you know, getting up there. But young populations might be slightly different. Like what do young people even do? So I don't have any answers, just sort of thoughts that I want to sort of explore in 2025.
I also said Southeast Asia.
Okay.
I think, to a large extent, I agree with what you just said there. For me, it's the population aging element that's actually kind of interesting. And I think that like BPO will definitely change, and it will change the landscape of Southeast Asia dramatically. But I think there's also like some non-AI forces at work. There's a huge migration of stuff that used to happen in China into Vietnam, for example, because China's no longer that cheap, but Vietnam is still very cheap. And I think that will reshape Southeast Asia. Vietnam is one of the youngest and most and largest populations in Southeast Asia. And I think that it will change. I don't know how. I think it's also just undergone a massive leadership change in 2024. At the end of 2024, the leader of the Communist Party died. And as far as Southeast Asian politics go, that's a pretty big change. And so it'll be interesting to see how it repositions itself over 2025. There's also been a big shift in Singapore, where for the first time we have a prime minister that isn't part of like Lee Kuan Yew's dynasty. So it was Lee Kuan Yew and then it was his son. And now it's for the first time someone outside the family, for the first time in Singapore's entire history as a country. And, you know, so I think it's like those kinds of just political shifts are not to be underrated. I also think that I generally agree with Jensen Huang's statement, which is that you're not going to get replaced by AI. You're going to get replaced by someone who uses AI. And if you frame it like that, I think young populations are going to win, because the older people are going to get completely outpaced. They were already kind of getting outpaced with just the advent of technology. Like, you know, fucking some people don't even know how to right click a goddamn mouse. You watch people like it's scary how young people, like, as in, like, you don't have to be that old, like maybe 50 plus, and you put an iPad in front of them. If it doesn't do exactly what they want, they just start getting angry and they just start randomly tapping it. You're like, I can understand getting frustrated, but why would you expect randomly tapping a touchscreen to be a sensible response? You're basically just having a tech tantrum. And this concept of a tech tantrum is just so prevalent in the older generations. And I think that it's going to get worse with AI. Whereas they're going to try and talk to GPT and it's not going to exactly give them what they want. And they're just going to fucking get frustrated and get angry at it. Whereas the young population is going to be like, fuck yeah, like, I'm just going to reprompt. Like, I'm going to think about this piece of technology in just a fundamentally different way and know how to use it in a fundamentally different way. And so I'm pretty bullish on Southeast Asia in general. I've also firsthand seen this migration of talent out of the West back home. Because essentially what you have is this political dynamic between the East and the West that is becoming more and more fraught. And it is actually having an impact on people. And so a lot of people who are based in the West, are Western educated, are Western raised, so to speak, culturally, returning to Southeast Asia and China. And the people who are wanting to leave China are actually starting to seek out Southeast Asia more than they're seeking out the West because of the political complexities, where Southeast Asia is a bit more neutral. And so I think it can kind of position itself as like a little bit West, a little bit East. It's not China, but it's not the US. And, a lot of people who, maybe of Chinese or Asian descent that don't necessarily want to go back home, but don't want to stay in the US. I see those people returning to Thailand, returning to Vietnam, and they're Western educated. So there is a skilled software engineer as someone in the West, but they're cheaper and they're not there, and ultimately contributing to the Southeast Asian economy.
Yeah, I think I noticed this in your team, my team as well. Like, there'll be someone in the Philippines or Vietnam, etc., and they have an American accent. You're like, what? Like, how did that happen? They're like, oh, I studied in San Francisco and I moved back. And I thought, like, oh, and you're still, like, you're willing to work for, like, a standard rate in Vietnam? That's insane. Like, you have such an edge.
Well, but that's the thing. It's not a standard rate. Like, a senior engineer there might cost you $5,000 to $6,000. That is half the average annual salary. Right. So their annual salary of whatever that's going to be, $60,000 is 6x the average annual salary. But to an employer for US style talent, that's an insane arbitrage. So both people win. Like, they get an incredibly good lifestyle. Because the only reason you want high pay in the US is because you live a certain lifestyle, you need that high pay. You can take half of that pay, live an even better lifestyle in Southeast Asia, and your employers are also going to be really happy with the deal that they're getting.
Yeah, I just need to find a country that's way more wealthy than Australia and that have that arbitrage opportunity. That's the dream. Okay, we have 2 more questions. No, 3 more. So, what has been your personal tech find? Like, favorite personal tech find? So something that's like enhanced your life in some way, either productivity, creativity, or just like improve life improvements.
Claude.
Okay.
Claude. 100% Claude.
I barely use Claude. I downloaded the Claude app and I was like, why do I have to record a voice snippet and then upload it? That doesn't make any sense. Why can't I just start a voice chat with it? Like, that threw me off.
I don't use the app. I use the website on my computer.
Yeah, but it doesn't have you can't just start a voice session and start talking to it, right?
I don't need to talk to it. I can type to it.
Cool. Like, it's interesting. I think like my usage of AI is slightly different to the way you would use it. And therefore like the medium actually matters quite a bit. Like, I do the AI walks quite frequently where I just go out for a walk and I'm just talking to AI. And a lot of the time it's like, hey, like I need to think through this thing. Can you ask me some questions one by one to help me clarify my thoughts or like help with my ideation here? And at the end of the session, I'm like, cool, let's like, summarize all of this. I'm just going to put it into a doc for myself. And I find that useful. So I'm talking to myself, but it's more guided through AI. And that's why the medium really matters to me.
That makes sense. I usually have a specific problem on hand that I'm already trying to solve. And like being able to type something out is actually necessary for me because I often need to type out 2 whole paragraphs and then go back and kind of edit it and put it in a style that I think the AI is going to give me something back that's meaningful, which is just, you can't like take back what you just said with an AI.
So mine was voice AI, and the other one was just like AI triaging. I just found like as a useful concept in general. So either for personal tasks, like AI categorization of my tasks. So it automatically tells me like what the task is, like what company it's for, like where it's meant to go. And so like I use Akiflow, which is actually quite useful, where I can, if I star a message on Gmail, if I save a message on Slack, if I there's like multiple inputs that all get sort of funneled into my Akiflow. And then Akiflow will use AI to basically just like tell me what tags are for each task, and I can sort of allocate it as I need to. And then even for customer support at entry level, like maybe you don't fully commit to using AI for customer support, but using it as a pre-filtering tool to triage it to the right team, like its accuracy is quite high for that, right? And like even if it makes like one mistake out of 1,000, it's okay because you just reallocate it to the right support agent or the right person. But like specifically triaging, I think it's like high accuracy, very simple to implement because you can train it on like, this is what a finance message looks like, and this is what a customer support ticket looks like. This is what a refund looks like, right? Like, yeah, triaging.
That's an interesting one. All right, so what is one skill or area of knowledge that you plan to develop in 2025 to stay ahead?
So in December, so last year you were my coding tutor for a bit. I think we did one session, and like I just didn't do it. And I also hired a coding tutor separately as well. Also didn't work out just because like I don't think the motivation was there. Like I just like didn't care enough. The pain wasn't great enough for me to make that change, right? In December, I had way too much free time. I played every single PS5 game over the last few months. Like I had like watched every single show I wanted to watch. Then I started thinking like, what's next? And so I started learning to code. Like I started learning Next.js and React, and I felt like I learned maybe within 20 to 30 hours, I learned maybe 5% domain expertise, or maybe more, maybe 20%. But with AI, it gave me like 75%, 80% coverage. Like I could do so much more than I was able to do before. And now like the initial learning curve of like 15, 20 hours, it enabled me to build a really cool website. So I made my personal site again on Next.js, which is cool. I'm really happy with how the design turned out. It's exactly what I wanted. But I maybe wrote 5% of the code. Like, but I knew exactly what to prompt for. I was like, cool, I need this logic for pagination. I need this. I need to use this API. I'm going to upload the documentation here. Like, just made so many things easier. So my takeaway here is that I want to become a terrible coder this year, because by being a terrible coder, I'll be a 100x engineer versus someone that doesn't know how to code at all, which will probably be a 10x engineer, right? So I want to give myself a slight edge by learning a little bit. That's my thinking.
Yeah, I think AI does make the jack of all trades way of approaching life even more valuable, because it can magnify your knowledge. So if you know 5%, it can 10x you at 50%. It can be really dangerous because if you don't know enough to pass out the shit that it's telling you, then it won't work. So I think when you apply it in the right domains, like if you apply it in coding, it's like for certain type, like product development, where you are a reasonable end user of your software, it's okay because you can just test the thing that got produced and see if it works. But like one thing that's really risky that I noticed when using it for coding, for example, is that if I try to use it to code physics-based things, I can't tell if I got it right because I don't know enough physics to critique it and see whether,
Well, I guess this is my point, right? Like, I want to learn enough so that I could critique what it's giving me, right? The same way, like, if I was to hire someone, I want to be good enough to know if they're good, right? Like, that's all I really need to know. And I need to be able to, like, look over the work and be like, yes, this is reasonable. This is good. And so the same way with the AI, like, when it gives me an output of, like, 300 lines of code, I can quickly skim through it and be like, cool, like, I understand what the logic is. I can read the comments. I can see what this loop is doing. I learned what a try-catch block is, so I can understand what that is doing, versus someone who is just getting this JavaScript file and shoving it in.
So that's very much like knowing the code. You can never get away from knowing the domain. And I think, that's actually that's my answer to this question. Like, molecular physics is a domain that I want to go even like deeper on and just get a deeper understanding of like, how do you compress a set of low-level calculations? So like basically a set of energy gradients, like forces basically on a bunch of atoms. How do you compress that into a higher level understanding of something? For example, like the highest level of understanding being, does this drug work? At the end of the day, the answer to does this drug work is just, do the atoms move in the right way? Are they subjected to the right forces over time on average? But that's an incredibly low, like, how do you go from that description to, like, from a low level description of the forces on every atom in, over time to a human ready description about this, or as, David Deutsch would say, an explanation of what's actually going on. Because like when someone, what's going on with this drug? And if you said, well, that atom moves over there, that atom moves over there, and you did that for every single atom, you haven't fucking explained anything, right? So how do you compress that low level? Because I understand the low level physics very well, but there's all these layers of theory and stat mechanics basically to take you to the next level. And I want to go deeper on that this year. The other thing I want to go deeper on as a product developer is like UI UX. I really loved UI UX that's how I actually got into the coding industry somewhat. And I think the advent of AI just changes the game for UX, and chats are interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day and I was like, threads, man, I just want threads. I want to be able to go back 10 messages and say, pick up from here and keep going. Because often what will happen is I'll discuss a topic and be like, okay, we need to talk about these 10 things. And then you need 100 messages on just one thing. And then you kind of got to wind all the way back to that original message and the original context. And so subtle things like this, like how do you structure a user experience with an AI? You were talking about, voice being one modality when you're walking around. How does that compare to text? Text is not very good, but it's possibly you need to integrate text and voice. And like I think it's experience everyone has had over Zoom is like when you're trying to instruct someone over Zoom, you're like, oh, click that button over there. It's like they can't fucking tell what over there means. And AI is not going to be any better at telling what over there means if that's all you say. And so how do you create an integrated user experience is an open-ended question right now.
I think that's a good area to innovate in as well, especially as we're figuring out these like user interface questions for AI. Like even the point where
it's also the area where like I feel like I'm intelligent enough to actually make a difference. Like actually building out these AIs, like fuck no, like I'm not the guy. I don't have the resources. I don't have the mathematical inclination.
I think you were the one who mentioned the fact that like for 3D printing AIs, they generate toggles where you can actually move the toggles as well. Maybe it wasn't you, maybe it was someone else. But basically you say like, I want a door frame. It then generates a 3D model of a door frame and then also generates a bunch of toggles that you can move. So you can change the height, you can change the width, just because natural language is not the best medium for generating 3D model, but it can get you the first part and also generate the toggles to allow you to have more input and fine-grained control.
Yeah, we did talk about this somewhere in the beginning of 2024. Yeah.
All right, final question. Bold prediction. What is your bold prediction for the tech world in 2025?
I don't think this is actually going to happen, but I answered it in respect to the second half of the question, which you didn't read, which is something that seems unlikely now, but would be game-changing if it happened. Superconductors. We have been flirting with superconductors. There's been a couple of like debunked studies, but it feels like every year we get 2 or 3 like maybes. Maybe this is the one. If that actually happened, and we actually got superconductors confirmed, room temperature superconductors confirmed in 2025 specifically, that would be fucking game-changing. Game-changing for transport, game-changing for energy, game-changing for artificial intelligence, game-changing for computing. Like I actually do think it would just be insane.
I think like one other caveat to it, like room temperature superconductors that are easy to build with and economically viable, right? Because obviously you can use ceramics, but they're not like super viable for using in like certain applications.
That's
and then if it's really expensive too, then it's not usable. I think
if you got a room temperature semiconductor, it would be game changing enough that people would genuinely rethink their strategy over the next 5 years in preparation for versions of that were.
Dude, I would rethink my life at that point.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like, what am I doing? Okay, I like that one. That's a really cool one. You definitely went into the more unlikely territory, but I think it would be cool if it was true. I think I went slightly more plausible. And I went with something a bit more businessy. And I don't actually think many people would disagree with this, but I think we'll see the first company to hit $100 million in revenue with 0 employees this year. Like absolutely no one. And this includes
Revenue?
the founder, revenue. And this includes the founder doing nothing besides visiting the bank and like pulling out money and like, that's more for
not even setting it up, as in like, it has to turn the AI on and give it its mission.
I think once it's set up, 0 employees, they just walk away. This isn't
there are companies with like 500 million market cap that are literally one AI that exist already. So I definitely don't disagree. I don't know about revenue, but like certainly.
Are you talking about like crypto?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like outside of crypto, revenue-based company, like it has a legal team, it has a marketing team, it's got everything going, like all the agents are set up, and it's just making money. That's it.
That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. I would love to say $1 billion, but I think I sort of set the bar at 100 million.
I think if you had 100 million in revenue, you would have a multi-billion-dollar market cap on your hands in that company.
If it had 0 employees?
If it had 0 employees.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, there's still other expenses that may not be included. For example, Facebook ads.
But the point is the promise, the multiple of your revenue is essentially a promise on growth, right? Yeah. If you demonstrated that this was possible, even principally, then like that's crazy.
Oh yeah, I'm sure a VC would invest at like an insane value, like insane multiple. I don't know about the public markets, but yeah, VCs for sure. Yeah. Anyway, maybe we'll start.
That's our 2025 wrap up. A little bit of a longer episode, but I think it's about time because we've done a couple of short ones recently and a couple of ones that I've just missed entirely.
I think that was a good episode. It was fun. Like it lasted long because I was enjoying the time. If you have any other ideas, let us know below. Like if you have an answer to one of the questions we put that's like slightly different or slightly more interesting, then hit us up. And also, if you haven't liked and subscribed, please do so. We want to double down this year on the podcast. We want to get better guests. We want to get better content. Who knows? Maybe in a research team.
I'm not going to say better guests. I'm going to say more guests because I'm not going to implicitly shit on the guests we've had to date. Thanks, AJ. I think we should do a fully AI episode where we just like train, like fine-tune an AI on all our episodes to date and just let them rant at each other for 30 minutes and see like what does AI Loong and AJ AI talk about.
I want to clarify that our guests so far have been amazing. But the issue is like they're all friends of mine and I haven't been able to get guests beyond like besides like calling them and being like, hey, can you please come on my podcast as a friend of mine? I know you have a $100 million company and you're ultra successful, but like do this favor for me. That's the sort of caliber of guests we can get so far. So high caliber, but like we really need to really wrangle them into the podcast. If you guys like and subscribe and we get heaps of people doing that, at some point, someone will call us and beg to be on the podcast, and that's the goal. So that's what I meant. Loong made me look like an idiot, and I wanted to like clarify that point. And to your other point, yes, let's do an AI podcast. I think it'll be fun. Like we have 2 other co-hosts. We can call them like AI AJ and AI Loong, and we'll train them on our like previous content or something. Yeah,
they're going to be insufferable.
Or we train them on our content and say like do the opposite of like this person. Yeah.
That'd be interesting.